I remember many years back a pastor saying, "Well, I don't like to use the word justice because it's a political word." And I was like, "What is wrong with your theology, dude? It's a biblical word." I
Yeah.
mean, it is the theme of the Old Testament. It
Yeah,
is
for sure.
what the restoration of God's salvation and his work in Christ is all about. It's all about the justice and the satisfying of God's holiness, that things have to be restored. So usually I just start with a theological conversation around Genesis 1, that God created everything good, functional, connected. That's what tov, that Hebrew word good, means. It's functional, it's connected, it works, it flows together. And then by the seventh good, it was a very good, this mihau tov, this forcefully and vehemently good. I mean, everything was created to be good and connected. And when everything was broken, in the Garden of Eden, that's really what happened, was this brokenness, this need to be reconnected, this need to be restored. And it was because of the justice of God that he said, everything has been broken. The things that I created good, whether it's in creation or my relationship with you, or how you're going to interact humans against humans with humans, all that brokenness is going to be satisfied in my restorative work because of my justice.
Good to go. All right. On today's episode of Rethinking Christianity, we have Michelle Warren, who is a faith-rooted activist, a speaker, an author. Her most recent title came out this week, called Join the Resistance. Thank you for coming on Rethinking Christianity. Super excited to talk about your title and just some of the work that you're doing and have been doing for a while now. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Blake, for having me. I need to make sure that it's Michelle Ferrigno Warren. I don't want to
Okay.
lose my Italian American heritage. And I think it's a really important part of who I am and how I see the world.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I wasn't sure, so I'm glad
It's a
I'm
hard,
glad you
what?
added
It's
that.
one of those hard last names that people are like, yeah, I don't know how to say it. So I'm
Yeah, I
going
didn't want to
to
mess
write
it up.
it. I
So,
appreciate that.
but that's cool. I appreciate you adding that in there. So, as we kind of, as we dive into today's episode, I'd love for our listeners kind of to hear a little bit about you, your background, how you got to where you're at today, where you're doing a lot of like activism and you're speaking and you're writing. And so I'd love to hear like what led you to the path that you're on today.
That is a really long story. And I don't
That's all
think,
right.
I just, I don't want to take too much time to get into the nitty gritty of it. But I will say this, I did not anticipate where I have landed. That if I had been writing my story, it would have been very small, and I couldn't have even imagined or envisioned who I am, or what God really has allowed and orchestrated in my life. So I grew up in white privileged America. Actually, grew up during the white flight and the Christian school movement. So I was in Christian schools my whole life, went to Cedarville University as a freshman and was there for 4 years. I studied mathematics and music and wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do with it. And so decided to teach middle school for a few years. And that was probably one of the best decisions I made as far as getting to know and getting to love a community that looked different than I did and that had just a whole different view and perception on the world. So I married my college sweetheart. We moved down to Dallas. He went to graduate school there, and I was a teacher in a local public school. I taught 7th and 8th grade math. And before we had gone to Dallas, Dave and I both really had wanted to do Christian ministry. We knew we wanted to, just as a series of events, we wanted to do ministry alongside poor people that just were impacted by economic and racial injustice. We didn't have that language back then. It was just more of this decision that we were going to do that. And so Dallas was really the first time to put real legs onto it, and moved into a community, an African American community. We were in Section 8 housing. I taught in the local public schools and really began to learn what it means to be a good neighbor. And I can't say I was making any of these strategic pivots on how I was going to embrace one or thing or another, but I do know that the defining characteristic of the decisions of my life is striving to be a good neighbor.
Mm.
From there, moved to Denver, and 26 years ago started a transitional home for homeless teen girls. So worked with people right off the streets, lived with them, and worked alongside them as they began to restore their own individual life. And we had a community called Open Door Ministries and Open Door Fellowship that started right around that same time. And Open Door Fellowship had been around for about 10 years. It was a church, often is referred to as the homeless church, mostly because it is located pretty much in a strip of, where there's a high concentration of poverty and homelessness historically, and even in the midst of gentrification still in Denver. And we started Open Door Ministries, which was a community development corporation. And together, the community, alongside, those of us who were choosing to join and live and work and worship together, wanted to see what could we do to develop ourselves as well as our community. And that led to a lot of different, I would say, very practical programs. That was from preschool to transitional housing, a little bit of affordable housing, internship programs so that we could invite other people in, businesses. I mean, you name it. Open Door Ministries is pretty big at this point as far as in its vision. It's rather large now in its budget too, but it was large in its vision. And Dave and I were super young, and I think if anybody had known what Open Door Ministries would have become, they never would have let a 25 and a 26-year-old start it. But we were grateful to be able to use our youth and our vigor, etc. But after being a teacher in the education system, after living in a community and worshiping, specifically worshiping with people who are impacted by racial and economic oppression and injustice, I began to ask a lot of questions. It's interesting, there's the word deconstruction is being thrown around a lot today, and that it's something that I really embrace. And it's because I'm a mathematician. Mathematicians and logic and philosophy are based on the principle of deconstruction. It's actually a healthy process of thinking, so long as that you recognize reconstruction has to come afterwards. And so my whole 20s was sort of that series of, I thought I was a good person who grew up in a good community, who wanted to do good in the world. And I was beginning to realize that if you wake up in the morning and the system works for you, you think it's a good system. And at first you start to defend it and try to make excuses for it, and thinking that, oh, well, what really is oppression and injustice and racism and a whole lot of other things, you begin to get a little defensive, like, wait, I don't think that was the intended consequence. And the longer you stay present, the more you realize there is some really big waters that are moving that none of us can swim against. At least it's something that we're going to have to change. So back in those early 90s, we weren't talking about systemic injustice, but that's what I was beating my head against the wall with. And I talk about that a little bit in Join the Resistance. So my first book is called The Power of Proximity, Moving Beyond Awareness to Action, because we can't fix problems we don't understand. And we're never going to understand them from a distance. And so this next book, When You Move from Proximity to Resistance, is really how do you, with integrity, embrace a world where injustice does not just happen and it doesn't repair itself. So what happened is my eyes were beginning to be opened a little bit more. I realized a math and music degree was not sufficient. That was sure nice that I figured out how to start a couple nonprofits, and there are people who let us use our passions and our gifts and came alongside us, and we built some really beautiful things. I knew that I needed to understand public policy, because that's the tables where decisions were being made that were impacting me and my neighbors in very tragic ways. Went to night school. My 3 kids, they can tell stories of where I was, and they were learning how to make dinner, etc. But all to say, I got a degree with a formation in public policy and multi-sector collaboration. And that really is when I started to move and pivot to working on systemic issues. It was a very big side hustle. Like, you get your regular job, and then the side hustle, we need to change systems. We need to build coalitions. We need to bring people to the table. I need to learn what it even means, to advocate, etc. And so that degree, plus my front hand experience and some of the work that I've done, launched me into really state and national work. And I've had the privilege for almost 10 years working for the Christian Community Development Association. And that is a national network of practitioners like myself, like my husband. We are all living, working, worshiping in this philosophy of ministry to the poor. There's lots of ministries, there's lots of philosophies, but this is a shared philosophy within CCDA. And so I got to work with so many people who were trying to both walk alongside each other in individual restoration, trying to work in social justice and restoration, but really try to do a better job of understanding how to engage systems so that people do not have to live lives of oppression. Like, we actually have the power to make change. And so, that was a real privileged job to be able to work with some fantastic leaders around the country. And we got to do some really amazing things. And that's a little bit of what has led
Yeah.
to me.
That's awesome. Yeah, I appreciate what you mentioned about your first title, proximity. In my own life, I realized so I grew up in middle class, you know, in a small town in South Georgia, and the history of especially in the southern parts of Georgia is pretty rough when it comes to the civil rights, back into Jim Crow, like all the way into the Civil War, and to this day, there's still, effects of all of that in those communities. And I didn't realize it, the advantage of my life that I had until I started playing football and I was around, I went to school with, African American, guys and girls or whatever. But when I started to actually be around them, where I would take them home after practice, give them a rides or whatever, I began to realize the basic things that I just took as like normal, having breakfast or my mom like making sure I had like all the stuff that I needed, just like things like that. And then began to realize that the house that I lived in at the time that I felt like wasn't really that big compared to some of my teammates where they're living with, 6 or 7 brothers or sisters, uh, and it's with a single mom. It was when I had that proximity to those people that I realized like, okay, there's something off with what's been going on. And it really, really challenged. I mean, Cordele, the town that I grew up in, has railroad tracks right up the middle of the town. And on one side of the town is the white side of town, and the other side is the more poor and black side of town. And I grew up knowing about it, but it wasn't until I was near those people that I was like, okay, this is off. This isn't right. And so that proximity that you mentioned is very vital. And I think that that's why a lot of people struggle with um, even engaging with these conversations, because it's easy for us to not want to have that proximity or want to engage with other people's stories. And so that was something that really, really challenged me. Did you, when you wrote that first title, were you kind of like planning on writing the second title, or was there something that kind of occurred that motivated you to write this title?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there's a third title. So it wasn't that I thought, oh, I'm going to have this trilogy. I really wanted to equip people to better understand their role as Christians in
Mm,
injustice. And as a professor, as somebody who ran an internship program at Open Door Ministries, it wasn't exclusively kids who had lifestyles like you were sharing or even mine that came in, but there were a lot of young people who were coming in. I thought, well, how can I really help people understand that it's not about us, and how do we decenter ourselves and really join a community? And so I had really had a very unique story and wanted to equip people, but I didn't actually really want to write the first book. Like,
mm,
it felt too vulnerable. I didn't really, like I said, didn't really want to center myself. I wasn't sure how to tell my story in a way that didn't make me sound like some triumphal person. I didn't want to utilize the stories of my neighbors in a way that would make them feel like they were sort of zoo animals. Like, isn't this a
yeah.
great social experiment? So I had to wait a long time for that one. But really, I wanted to write the book I wrote now, which was how do we really do justice? I feel like in the last 10 years or so, the church has, well, I mean, we've kind of flip-flopped a little bit, but I would say 10 years ago, the word justice was kind of getting some traction, the idea of social justice. I think there's been some reactions against it, and that's why I intentionally called it kingdom justice,
Yeah.
because I think kingdom justice is social justice, but that's probably for a whole different episode in a podcast. But I really wanted to write a book on the practical steps of joining the work of advocacy and activism for change as
Mm,
Christians. And what I heard was, well, people are already kind of writing about justice. And I'm like, yeah, but they're just talking about it. They're not doing it.
mm,
And so that was a little bit of a push and a pull. And then IVP was very gracious. And they're like, Michelle, we just really think you should build an audience. Your story is unique. Maybe you should start. And so I actually am now putting out the book that I wanted to put out the first time, which is This is How Christians Engage in Justice with Integrity. Because here's the problem. Sometimes, yeah, we're kind of afraid to engage because we might be construed as, some type of moniker, and there's hesitation. But then there are people that sometimes just as a reaction to their upbringing, out of anger, and I think anger can be a really good thing, come in and it's still about them. And I remember when the George Floyd protests were happening, having several conversations with African American friends who were like, okay, this is a new wave. We've never seen this many white people. I would concur. And the phrase that I think it was Michael Ray Matthews who actually said it this way, or at least was in that conversation. He's the deputy director of Faith in Action, which I would encourage your readers to check out. But he said, your wokeness, as far as white people, your wokeness is not an opportunity to perform.
Mm.
And so I just felt some of it is I wanted to write a book on justice because I'd been wanting to do for a really long time and been doing the work. But then I thought, I have this heaviness that people who are joining are actually doing more damage than they realize. I'm not going to say they're doing more damage, but they're doing to the whole movement, but they're doing more damage than they realize. And I wanted to write on how to do that and how to do it well, because I don't want people to stay away. We need a big collective group of people working and joining Christ in his restorative work in the world. And how do we join it? And so my book is broken up into three basic: we serve the movement, we stay at the table, we help our people. And while I wrote it with a very specific audience in mind, I will just say this as somebody who was an advocacy director of a national organization for almost a decade. These are the principles of advocacy and activism, no matter who you are. This is actually the work of justice. You have to serve the movement. You don't come in. I mean, we follow Christ, who humbled himself and led through service, that his love was defined through humility and service. And he even says that he is gentle and lowly. That's how he describes himself. So, we have to realize that the work of justice, as upsetting as the injustice has, that our first step is to serve the movement. The thing is that justice isn't on the timeline and it can't be checklisted off. The cost of doing justice will literally cost you everything. And while there are some people who may join for a year or two, I'm not going to throw skepticism at that. But if you're going to do transformational work, you need to stay a long time. You need to stay at tables where people don't agree with you or you don't agree with them, where they have different, not just faith ideologies, but cultures and races and racism and gender. Our fragility should not keep us from running away. We really need to stay in the discipline. To stay in the midst of such hard is really hard to do. And so then the third part is really helping your people. And that really came about from me literally sitting at physical tables in multi-faith contexts, doing the work of advocacy on issues like immigration, homelessness, a whole litany of issues. And I began to look around and realized, I'm the only one with evangelical roots. I'm the only one who goes to those community churches, and that whole group of evangelicals that maybe don't define themselves as Southern Baptists. Not that that's bad, but they often get sort of the louder microphone. But there's a whole group of us, and we're not here. And I'm not sure if we care, but even those who say we care, we're not being challenged to move. And so I began to realize that my role in the movement, there's a lot of them, but one of them was to help my people, to help, not just to help invite them, to help kind of build a bridge back home, because I had been gone a while. I went back for Christmas, right? Went back for fundraising, but really, how could I invite people into the true transformation of what kingdom justice looks like and join the work alongside people who were leading movements to reverse systemic oppression?
Yeah. Yeah, one of the observations that I had during, a lot of the stuff that happened with George Floyd that I struggled with at times, and it was just kind of like this participatory thing where everybody wanted to like have a voice about it, which is a good thing, I think, that in some ways. But the other part of it that I struggled with was, we can post on social media and we can show up to a march, and all of those things are good. But if there's no actual change in the way in which we operate our day-to-day lives. So for instance, the way I think about it was, I don't want to say anything if I'm not going to be willing to hear the voice of someone that disagrees with me on this, or change the people that I am, like my social life. Like, does my social life even reflect my care about this, the people that I'm around? And so, I began vulnerably, I was kind of frustrated at times because it was like, people just want to get in on the like real quick, like social media thing and things like that. And so, in regards to that, one of the things that you kind of talk about is how you show up is just as important as showing up. And what does that kind of like mean and kind of look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit, but for sure, the first couple chapters, I really explain that as far as how to walk in, and it's very story based. And then also that second chapter, as far as brave steps, it takes bravery to not center yourself. It takes bravery and humility to realize that this isn't about you and to really join in that flow of resistance. And social media is, so first of all, let me just say this, marching is really, really important. As sort of a political strategist and person who is often referred to as the architect, I want the right people in the right places at the right time to create change.
Yeah.
But really, it's the work between the work that we need to learn how to do. And that's what I talk about in my book, that I want people to come up in for a march. That's great. And how you show up and making sure that it's not about you, we're following the very first chapter in the first story. I talk literally about the George Floyd protests that I was in my city, and how many white people were there with Black Lives Matter t-shirts on. I mean, I used to wear a Black Lives Matter t-shirt back, in the Ferguson days. And it was so like, what's wrong with you? This is such a horrible thing. And I'm like, okay, there's a lot of people. And as we marched, for those of us who had been doing this, when people you always need to, and this is in the case of George Floyd, you want to center the people who are closest to the pain. So Black men go first. I mean, you would hear chants in the street, Black men first. That was the first social and cultural cue that they go first. And then African-American women and their children. I mean, that's who should be on the front of that march and of that suffering and that solidarity. And the rest of us should be following behind. But I literally watched teenagers and several white men, because I don't know why I didn't see white women. I'm not saying that they didn't do it, but in my experience, I saw a bunch of teenagers and white men push Black women out of the way to get a better view. And I was like, whoa, we don't even know how to show up well. We don't even know how to walk. That doesn't require us even opening our mouths, because actually we're going to have to learn to walk and to speak, not just see, but really add something to it. And if all we're doing is centering ourselves and not recognizing that people who are the closest to the pain are the ones that are supposed to be leading us, then we will have missed the whole point. So part of showing up well is trying to figure out where you belong. Why are you even here? I actually have a chapter in my book in chapter 6 that talks about the only reason that we're here. And sometimes that's really painful, because it's a sacrifice to stay at that table. It's a sacrifice to work on injustice. Everybody is sacrificing. There's not a whole lot of money in it, let me tell you that. But I do want to say this too about kind of the marching is people were already at the table trying to change policing before those marches.
Yeah.
As a result, we got some tiny, small change, not nearly enough. But these intersectional opportunities, like you have a Mike Brown in Ferguson, where people are starting to pay attention that never paid attention before, you can get some traction after that. The marching of George Floyd, the people who had been working for years at the table were now being heard because of people coming. So I would say in the work of movements, there's some very distinct things. There's the ongoing work, and then there's these, like I said, these catalytic opportunities. And it doesn't always have to be through tragedy, although it often is, where all of a sudden you're heard. And so what I wanted to frame was the work between the marching. I want to tell you about a class I used to teach it. I hope someday we offer it again at Denver Seminary. It was called Political Advocacy, Doing Justice in the Public Square. And in a seminary, I'm teaching pastors, right? And so that's not a typical class. And I taught that for a number of years, but my very first, and it was an elective for many people. And so why would you even choose to take a political advocacy class unless you wanted to learn to advocate on a specific issue? And I remember I would say the very first class was like, what issue do you want to see changed? What's an injustice? And they would write, like, put 3 or whatever. And you could feel the energy, like, finally I made it to this class. I'm going to do advocacy as a Christian. These are the injustices I care about. I mean, the energy was pretty palpable. But then I would ask how long. The second question is, how long do you plan on working on it? Now, granted, I never asked for any answers, but it got quieter, as people had to actually put the years that would be associated. And then I put the final one, which is, how many people do you know directly impacted by that injustice? How are you going to, how are you really going to join the work if you don't know people who are already directly impacted? That's where the work should start. is following the voices who are closest to the pain. That's what I mean by not centering ourselves, making ourselves out to be the hero of the story. We're
Yeah.
the circles of the story, and we need to be pursuing people and community parts of the communities and organizations that are centering the voices who are close to the pain. It's not just on, violence and unarmed killings of Black men and police reform, but it's on issues of immigration and education and food security and healthcare, homelessness, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, one of the things I'd like to hear your thoughts on is in the midst of a lot of this going on, obviously there are voices, and it's kind of confusing to me at times that are against, this idea of social justice. And, I appreciate that you have kingdom justice on there, but I think it's kind of an interesting thing where like you have to do that because of there's certain voices, I guess, in evangelical spaces, it seems, that seem to want to ignore or push that stuff to the side or kind of make this claim of, well, if we teach the gospel, that'll take care of it. But it seems contradictory at times because they don't do that with other issues that they care about. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are some voices that just seem so opposed to it?
I really feel like it's a lack of understanding. I remember many years back a pastor saying, "Well, I don't like to use the word justice because it's a political word." And I was like, "What is wrong with your theology, dude? It's a biblical word." I
Yeah.
mean, it is the theme of the Old Testament. It
Yeah.
is what the restoration of God's salvation and his work in Christ is all about. It's all about the justice and the satisfying of God's holiness, that things have to be restored. So usually I just start with a theological conversation around Genesis 1, that God created everything good, functional, connected. That's what tov, that Hebrew word good, means. It's functional, it's connected, it works, it flows together. And then by the seventh good, it was a very good, this mihau tov, this forcefully and vehemently good. I mean, everything was created to be good and connected. And when everything was broken, at in the Garden of Eden, that's really what happened, was this brokenness, this need to be reconnected, this need to be restored. And it was because of the justice of God that he said, everything has been broken. The things that I created good, whether it's in creation or my relationship with you or how you're going to interact humans against humans with humans, all that brokenness is going to be satisfied in my restorative work because of my justice. I'm going to reconnect us. And it's a process and it's a work. But then you read all through the Old Testament, that Hebrew word mishpat, the word of justice, is not just this punitive word, like this is just about punishment. It's, justice has this way of kind of swinging on a pendulum from side to side of consequences and opportunities. So the restoration of people is able to take place. And when you see that Hebrew word mishpat and justice used all throughout the Old Testament, it's not talking about just a singular individual restoration. It encompasses the whole. Biblical justice as defined in the Bible, means that it's not okay if I do well if my community doesn't do well. And so when you look at even at the Levitical law and all of the different ways that, God kind of orchestrates his justice so that it's equitable, not equal, but equitable, and that everybody has the ability to flourish, that to me should be what Christians are championing. And then you get into the whole promise of restoration was now Christ was going to come and he was going to connect us back to God, that we wouldn't have these hearts of stone, that we would have these hearts of flesh. And the essence of the gospel is restoration, which is what justice is. It's about restoration and repair. And so as you head into the New Testament, you can identify with Paul's frustration because you've got Pentecost, it's come, we've got a whole room full of people. This promised Holy Spirit that was going to connect us to God and to each other has now taken place. And the Galatians are kind of going back, treating things as though they were, the former things. And he's like, what is wrong with you? There's no difference anymore. It's over. The restoration has happened. Men and women, we don't live in a, post-fall, pre-Pentecost narrative. Jews and Gentiles, cultural, racial, all those lines, that's not the life and witness of a Christian. And then rich or poor, why would you ever separate along socioeconomic? That railroad that you're talking about in your hometown, it's in everyone's
Yeah.
hometown. And it's not just black and white. That poor people within the stratification of white sit on a separate railroad track as well. But the gospel is the restorative work of Christ. And it restores us to be in right relationship with God, right relationship with people, and whole people groups to people groups. So I have absolutely no idea why this has become a hard word, except
Yeah.
if you don't understand the power of the gospel, you apparently don't think you need the power of the gospel. You have decided, just like the Pharisees, that it's only for you, and so I'm just going to shut it down. Or you have just completely decided that the world has maybe tainted it and I don't want anything about it, even though you're supposed to be in the world. I don't know. I have no clue. This has been a big mystery to me, but I'm a professor at Denver Seminary as an adjunct and I teach about justice. So, the reason I put kingdom justice wasn't really just to help people with social justice. It was to give its own clarification. A lot of times we'll hear the word biblical justice, and I think it's even bigger than that. I think I think the kingdom is what I'm about. I think the kingdom, that's what Christ came to usher in. And the justice that we are working within is both individual, social justice means it's a societal justice that we are being restored to each other. But then the systemic has to do with the infrastructure that was birthed in racism and basically superiority.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate that you
Let me
mentioned.
ask you, why do you think that?
Well, I think it comes one. I think that so when I think about the kingdom of God, one of the things that changed my perspective on it was thinking about it as the upside down kingdom. That everything that Jesus is doing is counterintuitive to what our natural inclination is. And then also, like, I think misunderstandings of words in the Bible, like what you mentioned, that word mishpat. I think of in Micah, where they are intentionally changing a system that has been occurring to create justice. And it's like so when I read those passages, I just am like, well, that seems to be pretty clear that we should be participating in that. Then you see where Jesus is engaging with the people that it doesn't make sense for him to engage with in that culture. And it shows that he's not looking to benefit in anything personally. He's looking to bring about the gospel and the justice that he's bringing about through his work and his servanthood. And so when I think about like that upside down kingdom, and then in Galatians as well, we're 6:2, Galatians 6:2, you're called to carry the burdens of other people, for this is fulfilling the law of Christ. And so I don't know either. It's kind of it's a insane thing. And I think part of it is I think people worry. Um, I don't know. I think if you go about it right, I don't think there's anything to be worried about. But like I mentioned earlier, the contradictory thing is, they're very people that usually voice against that are very open to voice against and march against the things that they actually care about, such as abortion or gay rights or those things that they think matter. They will do it, and they won't just preach the gospel in those situations, but it's the situations that I think that they don't necessarily care about. And part of it is, I think that proximity is one thing that you mentioned. And then I think empathy is another huge thing
I
is
actually talk
very
about
powerful.
empathy a lot in my book. I won't bring that up right now unless you want to a little bit later. But I think another thing is, okay, so you brought up Micah, and I'm going to bring up Amos, right? So in the book, every single chapter, I highlight a prophet, because the work of resistance should not be an unfamiliar work to a Christian, because we have the foundation of a God who literally has his foundation of his throne, metaphorically, is justice and righteousness. I mean, these are the cores of who he is. I think it's really important for us to know that we all join in this legacy of resistance. We cheer the prophets on now as we look in hindsight, but we wonder what kind of people we would have been under their leadership. Jesus came and he pushed back his prophetic words. I mean, he was not just a human, he was fully human, fully God, but he was like a prophet of a time to push back, to share the truth of who God was. Of course, do both foretelling and forthtelling, but he literally spoke against the rulers of the day and how they were holding such a small version of who God was and only keeping it for themselves. I mean, that was pretty much his full-time job, for those 3 years, was to set the lies true. And so I don't see a whole lot different
Yeah.
today. But I want to go back to Amos because there's a very famous metaphor of, righteousness and justice being like, let it flow down as streams of justice and rivers. And oh, that would be the case. And in the Hebrew, you've got mishpat, but you've also got tzedakah, which is the Hebrew word for righteousness. And they are often linked together. that to live a righteous life is to live, it becomes justice. That there's this really beautiful connection. It's almost like they kiss. They're
Mm,
so close. Like I cannot be a righteous person unless I care about the health restoration of every single one. That my righteous acts become mishpat.
mm,
Not what I've declared righteous, but what God has declared righteous. In the New Testament, I will never forget when I learned that there was not a distinction between righteousness and justice, that in the Greek it's the same word. And so that you could actually flip it out. If we flipped that out and changed righteousness when we see it in the New Testament to the word justice, I think the way we would respond in our living would actually be more just because we've made righteousness about individual piety.
mm. Yeah, that's interesting because I was gonna see what you thought about how, because our society, especially Western, specifically Western culture, is a very individualized society, and it's very different compared to like other cultures, very family oriented in like other parts of the world. But do you feel like because of our, everything is about the individual, like social media is about the individual, you're like everything we do is about just us and what we can do for ourselves. I mean, it's kind of the American dream, so to speak. Do you feel like that has played a role in, like kind of what you're mentioning about, empathy and righteousness, and it's even been integrated into our Christianity, where everything that the church does a lot of times in, like, it's centered in on the individual. How do we reach the individual?
100%. 100%. I talk about that a lot in my first book too, because I think a lot of our Christian cultural norms have this cultural bent to it. How could it not? I mean, we read and experience everything through our own personal lens, and and we just need to discipline ourselves to recognize that we need different lenses to to help us. But 100%, it has done a lot of damage for us to think as Christians only through this hyper individualistic, pull yourself up your by your bootstraps as though you all have boots. That kind of mentality has done a lot of destruction in the church, where we are taught in the New Testament that we are all members of one body, and that
Yeah.
we are supposed to be working in this consistent, this whole, holistic way. Here's the thing with individualism, it declares that you are the head of the body. And that is very dangerous when Christ is supposed to be our head. All the brains and all of the what the body's supposed to do and all the neurotransmitters are actually supposed to be sent from Christ. And
Yeah.
we, no matter where we are around the world, we are that functioning body. And we aren't complete without all of our parts. And I would say that when you have a privileged lifestyle, you're pretty self sufficient. And so you don't think you need other parts to be whole. And you don't even realize how sick you are. So if you think about the body's going to compensate, right? If you don't have like a couple appendages, you'll figure out how to get around on the others. If you are missing sight in one, you compensate for the other. I mean, bodies adapt, but it doesn't work as efficiently and as effectively. Here's the thing: is the body of Christ has the ability to work beautifully, and we don't even know that we've lopped off whole parts, and we're getting around. We're getting around. We're doing it. But because of that individual mindset, because we forget that Christ is the head and not us, and that we are dependent, interdependent on people from all different walks of life, all different places in the world, different cultures, etc. And I will tell you, the United States is pretty diverse. In my community,
Yeah.
it's not as individualistic,
Yeah.
especially, it's just not how it is. And so yeah, I definitely think that has just done a lot to deteriorate the body of Christ imaging that we learn in the New Testament and are supposed to pattern our church after. And it has given us an excuse as why we don't actually have to care about the pain of literally the other parts of our body.
Yeah. Another thing that I think has become really unfortunate in I guess church spaces, and this is the another impact of just going back to, segregation and things like that, is how like, you know homogenous like churches are. Like, the church that I work at, I'm in my office right now. We're a very white church.
Mhm.
I mean, pretty much everyone that goes here is white. And that's how it's been at different churches that I've been at. And it's just crazy. It's like, it's not shocking that our perspective of other people is not there or not present, because if we're not around it, and it's completely like contradictory to what the gospel in the church should be. It should be this like beautiful mosaic of all like social classes, all races and gender.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's another thing that is really interesting to observe, and the impact that that has on people's response to these things.
Mhm. 100%. Agreed. It kind of even goes in some of the disillusionment of many Christians today. It's like they see things, a lot of even what you're describing, and then they see injustice, and the church really do nothing about it. And it's sort of the integrity of all of what we have as Christians to engage a broken world. Because of that poor public witness, so many people have
Yes.
been doubting should we even be trying this? Like, what is the purpose of this at all? I might as well just not, I'll take off sort of the guilt of it and just be free.
Yeah.
And I can identify with that. I just had a young person talk to me about it, and she's like, how do you stay engaged? And I was just like, well, I do two things. I was like, one, I live in a poor community and I hang around people who, are clinging to God in joyful ways because of need. And so that's one, it's beautiful. I love my neighborhood. I'm sad that we have less resources and I don't want to stay there. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's just like the world is bigger than our experience. And I said, so I try to learn from my community and their joy and their contentment and their peace, even while, we work to change, or they work to change and I join them in changing, circumstances. But the other thing is the global church. Those are the two things that give me a lot of hope. Christ doesn't need me to defend him. If he really is the way, the truth, and the life, he can defend himself. But I really would like for people to get a bigger idea of what the kingdom is supposed to look like. I feel like, I should probably hold up my book or something, because I know
Yeah.
I'm getting a little off track, which is okay, because these are really important things. And I think because of the atrophy and the stagnation in the Christian church in America to engage in justice, we haven't really given a
Yeah.
reason why we need Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there a certain portion of the book that you were most fired up to write about? Obviously all of it. I know you're
You
fired up.
know, you
I
know
always
what?
like asking.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I'm a pretty passionate person, and I think the thing that makes me the most excited on a personal level is I was able to really digest a lot of prophets. I mean, I have so much. I learned so much through the book, and so I was really grateful that often I grew up in churches and reading and learning about things I already believed. And we didn't hang out too much in the prophets. And my last 25 years has been there because I really want to understand the heart of God. And that's really where you get to see it and what makes him passionate and what makes him grieve at such deep levels. And so, one, I'm very fired up that the theological undertones of this book is on prophets. But the thing is, this is so practical. When we step into the work of justice, it doesn't start when we become aware of it. Like, it has been going on, like I said, since the beginning of time, when everything that was good became very, very desperately broken. And I think one of the things that makes me really fired up is all of the stories of the cloud of witnesses that I share. So through the entire book, I lift up stories of people who were doing justice, and they're regular, ordinary people who did not even realize that they would become a part of history, that they were stepping into the next hard thing on behalf of themselves sometimes, but also on behalf of their neighbors, and just this desire to see a more just and peace-filled world. And so they stepped up, and then one, action led to another, and great transformative change. So I was really excited to be able to share some of the amazing people that I have learned from. So we stand on the shoulders of people who've gone before us, right? Whether we recognize it or not. And so the thing I guess I'm the most fired up is that people are going to learn about amazing shoulders that we stand on. We get inspired by people who have gone before us, and we see a way forward as a result of it. And I think they do a great job of, lighting for us a path forward. And so I'm probably the most fired up. I know it's not just one part of the book, through the entire book. There's that piece. And then I've been a worship leader for over 20 years, and I'm a musician. I told you I got a degree in math and music. And every chapter I highlight a song of the struggle. And I think just the singing of songs, and that's a very typical practice when you're doing marching or you're doing activism, is to sing what you believe, whether you see it or not. And so I highlight songs of the struggle and talk a little bit about each one of their history and why I thought it was an important thing to call out. So I know it isn't probably just one thing, but I'm just fired up about some of the structure of the book and all the potential to learn from people who've gone before us.
Yeah, I think that the impact, like, it's easy to prevent or present information, but when you present stories, people really connect with that. And as I was being able to read through some of it, like, I was like, okay, wow, this is, that's what really impacts people, is when you hear the experience of others and you see what other people are doing. And so I really appreciate that in this title. How do you hope that this book will help shift perspectives of people that are maybe on the fence or wanting to engage with doing justice work?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope may nothing else happen that lands us all in the streets. But if it does, I hope we're a little bit better equipped, not just for that day, but we'll have done some work ahead of time. I think I have a special care and concern for 20 somethings. I always have. I've done as a professor, I've done a lot of training and ran internship programs. And I just feel like if you gave me a room of 20 somethings, like we could literally change the world. I just love their hopeful optimism. And I don't feel like there's as much optimism anymore, because they just see so much pain. And so my hope is that as they read this book, they can see a vision of themselves working towards good kingdom work. And so that is definitely something I really, really hope. I don't think the haters are going to pick it up, my friend.
Yeah,
if you don't see injustice and you don't think that that's the call of a Christian, I didn't write this book to you.
yeah,
But not to say you couldn't pick it up, but really, I just think that there needs to be a place for faith-rooted activism. And frankly, not enough people are talking about it. And so my hope is that there will be a curiosity by some, and that for those who are in it will have even a stronger sense of direction. So that's kind of three things, right? Young people who are trying to figure out if this is what if faith in Christ would be their adult practice forever. My hope is that they can see that this is an amazing legacy, and that it doesn't have to be done a certain way, or kind of a preconceived ways, but that we can just kind of blow the walls off, the existing church, and really be the church in very active ways, in public ways, in the streets. And then, like I said, people who are wanting to, kind of be a little bit more curious. And then, of
yeah,
course, but I just want to. This is a movement going on. Whether you miss it or not, it's happening. And I
yeah.
wanted to give a message that this is how you can tap into it. You don't
Mhm.
have to. You shouldn't stand on the sidelines. As a Christian, you should be, with people, not because it's the cool thing to do. Because I promise you, the longer you do it, the less cool you'll be.
Yeah, yeah. So say there's a listener here. It's like, you know what, I want to get involved, or I want to join this movement of being a part of bringing about change in some place. What would be, if to them, your kind of advice on maybe like a first step of practicality?
Mhm. Well, it would be to lean in, right?
Yeah,
You should not be doing advocacy apart from people who are directly impacted. And I'm going to tell you, social media. Now, like I said, I was a national director of advocacy. I know how to utilize social media and
yeah,
earned media. I mean, it's a really great thing. I'm grateful for podcasts. There's a place for things, but you have to understand that activism is not done on social media.
yeah,
It's like playing fantasy football. You literally are not doing anything of that substance. You're all fired up, you think you're engaged, but literally you didn't feed that football player, you did not drive him to practice, you did not, stand there, you're not helping them when they win or I mean, literally, you got no credit whether you win or
yeah,
lose on fantasy football. There is an active ground grassroots working you need to get involved in. I'm not saying you can't like social media. That's fine. I do
yeah,
some social media, but that is not where the action, that's not where transformation is taking place. It's not in the virtual world, it's in the real world. And the way you engage is one, you never do it apart from people who are directly impacted. And so it may just be starting what organizations are working with immigrants and refugees.
mm, yeah,
And then as I serve, How are you handling yesterday's DACA ruling? How are you handling that presidential candidate saying this and people shipping people in buses to Martha's? Like, you get to have organic conversations, and you know what? Then they invite you in,
Yeah.
and you get to say things like, I really just want to serve the immigrant community and really help reverse things around immigration. Do you know where to go next? Because what I don't want to do is do too much. I mean, I actually am getting ready to launch some things on my website so that you kind of have an idea, but it's all community based. Find the community based people who are living it and
Yeah.
join them in that work. And if you don't see it, then after a lot of discernment and checking with people there, I mean, you shouldn't be starting anything new. There's a lot of stuff
Yeah.
happening,
Yeah.
but I mean, maybe there's some obscure thing after some wisdom. I don't want to say there's never a place for something new. I just want you to know there is an active movement going on, and you need to find it.
Yeah. That's awesome. So you mentioned a little bit that you talk about empathy and love in the book. I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on just how that impacts all this, and like, because it's so easy to throw the word love around.
Mhm.
Um, how do we like truly show love through doing this work and joining the resistance?
Yeah. So, I talk a lot about 1 John 3:18, that we cannot continue to love in words and speech, but in action and truth. That's sort of the theme of the whole thing. And what is our action? What's our true action going to look like? And the whole purpose of faith rooted activism is to take your personal convictions to the most public of places. And that's why people will recognize, like, I live in a predominantly immigrant community. 86% of my zip code is Latino. I am a fierce advocate for immigration alongside my community. Nobody wonders what side of the immigration issue I'm on because
Hmm.
my love is that public. I love what Cornel West says, which is justice is what love looks like in public. That's what activism will enable you to
That's
do, is
good.
you make it public.
Yeah.
It's just not, oh man, there's no waffling. It's like, I know Michelle is for us in the immigrant community. Her love and her demonstration of what love looks like, it's it's unquestionable. That's what activism is about. So help your people is that final section. And I'm going to tell you, quite frankly, this is actually the first podcast I've done directly on the book. So I'm learning to find my words, by the way. Thanks for the invite.
Hey. Yeah.
I still can't read chapter 7 without crying.
Mm.
It is so deeply personal because as I walked into loving in such action and in truth, I got rejected a lot from my former roots.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's hard to turn back and want to love and really engage, and you can't help the people you don't love. And the parable of the prodigal son, God was giving us all these great things, and we're trying to follow his agenda and his truth and love the stranger and welcome the stranger and care for the sick and care for the poor. I mean, Matthew 25, that's what we're supposed to be doing while we're waiting. That's like the Advent chapter. While we wait for Christ's
Yeah.
return, this is where we're supposed to be investing. And people left and they sold the truth of God for a lie, and then they come back and they're like, I want to work on issues of justice. I want to care about the poor. I mean, I was like the elder brother, like, too bad.
Mm.
I don't want you back. You left. And so my own heart has been very, very challenged and tested um, by the fact that you can't help the people you don't love. And that my purpose in living and working and worshiping wasn't to get a new life and disregard the life that I had, but really to lean in and build a bridge back. And empathy, I think empathy and forgiveness go together. And that is chapter 8 of my book. I talk a lot about the work of empathy. Empathy, I often, in a lot of my trainings around race and justice, try to help people understand that you can't, first of all, you shouldn't apologize for the experiences that you're brought up in, and you can never understand anybody else's exact experience, but
Yeah.
the human emotions of those experiences will enable you to connect. And that seems really good on paper or even as you hear it, but what I put in the book is I kind of talk about Brene Brown's very great work in realizing that you can't be empathetic if you're feeling shame, and especially in the areas of race. and the divisions around race, what I've seen specifically with people that are white like me, is that they haven't dealt with their guilt and their shame. They don't realize that guilt is when you do something actually wrong and you need to apologize for it. And that shame is when you just think you're a bad person. And so as you learn about the pain and injustice of the world, whether global poverty, racism, the whole gamut, I feel like white people white people just struggle so much with the shame of I must be a bad person. And what shame does is it breaks down curiosity. You actually can't be curious about anybody else and anybody else's experience because you're protecting yours and the goodness of your perception. So you can't be curious, and that's very dangerous. But you also can't be empathetic. And so, whether it's building bridges to a different generation or to peoples whose political ideology is your exact same age, you have to figure out how you're going to deal with your guilt, deal with your shame, so that you can be curious. Oh, I'm curious. How did you come to that? Not to attack first, but genuinely be curious. And then also be open to, I'm scared. And this is why I think immigrants should not be able to come from the border and we need a big wall. I mean, like, these are the conversations I have.
Yeah.
I can't shut them down. I mean, people look just like me. We came from two different ideas. And so sort of, you don't just come to a third way. You don't come to a place of understanding if you're fighting each other through these clouds of shame.
Yeah, and it can be, at least for me, it can be really hard to have like these discussions with people that are just completely on the opposite side of the spectrum and just like we write them off. But it's like that is also a part of this, is having those conversations and um being okay with the fact that that person may never agree with you, but it's just have like that's hard for me, and I know it is for a lot of
You know what,
listeners.
Blake, I will tell you, you are not very different. You're just sort of ordinary in that regard. I think it's hard for everyone. I haven't
Yeah.
met a person that is just a normal human response is to struggle with people who don't agree with us.
Yeah.
And that is something we got to work on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. What would you say to, I have a lot of listeners that they see, the church and they observe the church and they're kind of on the fringes of deconstruction or doubt or whatever. And on top of that, they see the kind of misrepresentation of Jesus in the response to justice of like, well, we're not doing that or we're not engaging with that. What would you say to that listener that all they're seeing maybe is the negative response, and it's impacting their viewpoint on God and Jesus and even just Christianity as a whole?
Yeah. Well, I think that's part of the resistance too, right? I, I don't think we have to protect, and I'll just say the white evangelical church.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
yeah. That
I'm
that
not
is
gonna
what it
fight for any
is.
of that. Yeah, I'm not gonna fight for any of that. I
Yeah.
I mean, I just say, go get a new church,
Yeah.
you need a church that's going to disciple you in a way that is grounded in true theology and that equips people to be salt and light in the world.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't be loyal to like the certain type of cultural church, but I wouldn't give up on God. I mean, like, there's a lot of bad representation out there, but we need to go deeper. That's sort of what I was saying. Deconstruction is actually a very healthy thinking. So, but you've got to reconstruct it. And sometimes the hurt and the trauma is like, well, I'm not going to. And
Yeah.
then I'm going to say, please don't do that, because God really in his essence is good. And that Christ really does satisfy and reconcile and seek to restore all things to himself, the individual, the social, the structural. And that I really believe that he has given us the tools that we need to not only have our own individual comfort, but to have comfort in the world. So, yeah, I mean, I would not, sometimes you just got to stop beating your head against a wall, and you need to go on a bit of a journey of reconstruction of who really is God and who is his word, not what it has been taught through the culture of the church, but really through his word and through people who love him. Um, and I just say I wouldn't give up on Jesus. I,
Yeah.
I wouldn't give up on Jesus. I mean, he didn't do a lot of things we're angry at. You know,
Yeah.
back in the days that he came, he was speaking against the leaders of the temple because they had gotten it so wrong. And finally, people who had been dehumanized by the church were being rehumanized by him. And I would say that Jesus is in the business of rehumanizing. And so if you don't feel seen and you feel like you've been dehumanized, go tussle with Jesus alone and let him rehumanize you and really build the building blocks up of what true religious practice should look like. I mean, I love, of course, James talks about true religion and, orphans, widows, poor, but all the prophets say that too. They're like, you are getting it so wrong. You have missed the heart of God. We're missing the heart of God today too. We're no different than the generations who've gone before us. And let us not be the next generation that continues to either give up on Jesus or play into a game that isn't really helping anyone. Martin Luther King Jr., he was a pastor. First of all, he was a very unloved pastor. I mean, he was probably loved by his parishioners, but he had a very bad national, rating. Nobody thought he was such a great guy. There's a reason that he was shot and killed. And he was a martyr. He was a martyr. But he had a very profound way of talking about the church and the church in public and civic witness. And he said, the church is not the agent of the state, but it's more like its conscience.
Mm.
And that we need, and the problem is that what we're noticing is that churches are not engaging issues. Oh, it might be just too political. Okay. First of all, separation church and state is nothing to do with the church. Okay. You really should bring, what's going on. You're supposed to live in the world. This cultural line of what's political and what's not political needs to be really blown up. Because if you say that, immigrants who are running for their lives are political, no, you're missing it. That's not political.
Yeah.
That is caring for the very people that God told us to care for. But anyway, Martin Luther King Jr., he says, churches shouldn't be, the agents of the state. I'm going to it's probably a famous quote, but I'm going to talk the spirit of the quote rather than the exact word for word. But, it should never be its tool. It should be its, basically its moral guide, its moral conscience. We can't separate ourselves. And he said, if the church loses that kind of zeal, where it's engaging, like think of the sons of Issachar. They knew the times and they knew how to respond. That if we as the church actually lose that zealous recognition that we are not supposed to go along and be the tool and the agent, but that we should be testing and proving at what God's good and perfect will is for the people of God in the midst of all of that. It says if we lose that zeal, that prophetic zeal, this ability to speak into what we see as unjust, then we will become an irrelevant social club. I got better things to do on a Sunday morning than be a part of some irrelevant social club.
Yeah.
My whole purpose in the world is to be an active agent of light and darkness and salt in a tasteless place. And so losing that prophetic zeal to discern and determine how I'm going to engage the biggest, most controversial issues in the world today actually is what Christians should be doing. Not for the apologetics of it. I'm kind of tired of stodgy academia. I don't want to have that conversation. I want to know what we're going to do with what we know.
Yeah. Yeah. And your words today they're challenging me, and I'm sure they will challenge listeners as well. And I'm looking forward for people to hear or read your title, Join the Resistance. I think that I think that as people begin to engage with this more and more, they'll realize that I think you begin to, at least in my experience, when I have served people, that's when I feel honestly the closest with God, and I feel as though like I'm truly living out what Jesus calls us to be, as being what you mentioned, that light and darkness and taste, or salt in a tasteless place. And there was a reason why people confused Jesus with the previous prophets. They would ask, is this Elijah or is this Elisha? And he'd be like, no, but there's a reason why. And that reason is because he was actively engaged with the very things that were wrong in that era and that day and age. And so I think that as we are engaging with Jesus, it is impossible to not engage with the injustice around us. And so it's like one and the same. And so
it's one and the same. It's the purpose.
Yeah. And so I really appreciate this title and this work and what it's going to do for people that read it. I hope that some of the haters will pick it up. I hope that people.
We can always hope, right?
Yeah,
We'll
we
know
can
on
hope.
Amazon reviews. I'll get some of those haters. Let me just at least share a quote that
Yeah.
Desmond Tutu. So Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he just passed away in December. He led the Truth and Reconciliation Commission when they were ending apartheid in South Africa, and just an amazing Christian. I mean, talk about being excited about a Jesus follower. Like he's somebody to know and to follow in his works and words. But he says, we're not responsible for what breaks us, but we are responsible to repair it.
Mm.
And I think that that's probably a takeaway that I want for myself, for you, Blake, and for the church today, is we are not responsible for what has broken us. We're not responsible for what we've inherited. We are responsible for putting it back together. And the only way you can do that is through truth telling. You've got to be honest about what's really going on and work towards the restoration. And the truth, while it may set us free, it's like cutting cancer out. It's that painful to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Michelle, thank you so much for coming on Rethinking Christianity today. Like I mentioned, these things are challenging for me, and I know they're challenging for listeners. And I just appreciate, your wisdom and your work, that the active work that you're doing. You're an example that people can look at and be motivated by and do. Things like what we're called to do. You're living that, and it's a very, I know, not easy thing to do. And so I just want to thank you for your work, and thank you also for coming on today. Is there anywhere people can find more of your work, and maybe if you have any talks that you've given or anything like that? You mentioned that you'll have some stuff coming out on your website.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, y'all. I've been doing so much work. I haven't been talking too much about it. I should probably put more stuff on my website. I don't have that kind of thing. You can find me at michelleferrignowarren.com, and there are some things there for sure. Of course, my first book, The Power of Proximity, it has a study guide with it, and it's been very helpful for groups. Join the Resistance also does, after it has study questions. And so those are really great ways to step into, your next steps. But for sure, you can find me. I need to kind of up my social media game again. I ran for US Senate in the 2020 election. And so between that and COVID, and, I'm just like, yeah, I guess I probably need to have more of a public face, but I'm doing the work, right? So my question is for you guys, of course, be inspired by those two books. If you want to do a book club or you want to get in touch with me, and I'm happy to pop in virtually for an hour of your talk. I've done that for years before the pandemic. I'm happy to do that. But yeah, I've been kind of doing the work. So I would just say, join me in the street.
There you go. Yeah.
And then just follow me on social media. Although you can follow me, like I said, MichelleFerrignoWarren.com, and usually my handle is at MCFWarren as well.
Cool. Awesome. And I'll post a link to your website and an Amazon link to join the Resistance in the listen notes. Go buy the book, go check it out, be inspired and encouraged. Thank you so much again for coming on. I really appreciate the wisdom that you've brought to Rethinking Christianity today.
Thanks, Blake.